I'm Cal Raustiala. I direct the Burkle Center for International Relations here at UCLA. Today's special lecture honors the life and work of Daniel Pearl, who 16 years ago this month was tragically murdered in Pakistan while working as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. A free and active press has been an essential feature of our democracy since our founding. It's also an invaluable window on the world around us. And as a foreign correspondent, Daniel worked to devote his life to seeking truth and to bringing that truth to us. He risked and ultimately gave his life in that pursuit. Today we honor his legacy, and for the 2018 Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture, we are fortunate to have one of the world's great figures in foreign affairs journalism. FAREED Zakaria is a true public intellectual, the author of numerous influential books on foreign affairs, the host of his signature television show, FAREED Zakaria GPS on CNN, and a regular commentator and writer in the Washington Post. Now, before we get to hear from him, we have a few preliminaries, as we traditionally do at the Pearl Lecture. We'll begin with remarks from Judea Pearl, Daniel's father. Judea is president of the Daniel Pearl Foundation, as well as professor emeritus of computer science here at UCLA. In 2011, he received the Turing Award for his groundbreaking work on artificial intelligence. Following Judea Pearl, our partner, Rabbi Lerner of UCLA Hillel, will come and say a few words as well. I'll then introduce our special guest. He'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then he and I will sit down in those chairs to have a brief conversation, and we'll open it up to questions from all of you. We have handheld mics, so when we come to the question period, please wait for me to call on you, and please wait for the microphone. Now, please join me in inviting to the stage Judea Pearl.
Thank you, Carl, for the kind introduction, and 1,000 thanks goes to our co-sponsors, the Burkle Center, especially to Alexandra Lieben and Sophia Rensch for making this event possible, for rescuing us from the cyber attacks and taking over the registration, which was a real chore this year. Thank you all for being here with us. I see family, friends, students, colleagues, and supporters of the foundation, and everybody here from the Los Angeles community for whom the annual Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture has become a cultural landmark dedicated to shared values and shared aspiration. It was exactly 16 years ago, February 21st in 2002, that we received a terrible phone call from the American consulate in Karachi, Pakistan, telling us that a video was found, that he watched the video and that he doesn't have the heart to tell us what he saw. Now, Daniel's murder has shocked many communities in the entire civilized world, but in particular, it shocked his journalist friends into realizing that they no longer are protected by that invisible aura of safety that they imagined they had before that day. It also shocked them into asking more profound questions, such as, who are we? What is our role in the cosmos? What is the driving force that compels us to believe so deeply that moving truth from one place to another makes a difference in the world? And who anointed us with the skill and authority to tell facts from fictions, to tell the essential from the peripheral, and real news from fake news? At the first memorial ceremony in 2003, Catholic bishop by the name of David Newhouse made an interesting observation that touches on these questions. What is the modern equivalent of the biblical prophet? He asked the journalists. Isn't the prophet like the journalist one who mediates reality for us? Can Daniel the prophet and Daniel the journalist bear similar messages to us? Isn't the journalist the one who serves today as the moral compass of society? I'm not sure how comfortable our speaker, FAREED Zakaria, would feel in the role of biblical prophets, walking up and down the streets of Jerusalem in a white robe, I suspect, exposing corruption and decrying institutional injustice and incompetence. But FAREED is surely the one key voice who mediates reality for us and serves as our moral compass. So much so that some of my friends have started going to the church on Sunday morning, not to miss the GPS show on CNN. There's another connection between our speaker and biblical prophets. Zakaria, as you know, as you surely recall, is the name of one of the most inspiring and hopeful prophets in the Bible. Let me read to you just one passage, FAREED, so as to arm you with a divine vocabulary for your speech tonight. These are the words of the Lord. Once again shall old men and old women sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each leaning on a cane because of their great age, and the street of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the street. I have the Hebrew version just to make it more poetic. ורחובות העיר ימלאו ילדים וילדות משחקים ברחובותיה. And with this divine message of peace, I would like to thank you profoundly, FAREED Zakaria, for honoring our son with your lecture tonight, and for everything you and the journalistic community are doing to keep his legacy alive. Thank you.
So I think it's possible that maybe we should change Judea's title from professor and doctor to rabbi. Quite an extraordinary Devar Torah there, or word of wisdom for us all. I'm Rabbi Lerner. I run the Hillel at UCLA. I'm so glad to see all of you tonight. I've been thinking a lot about optimism. The hashtag or sort of tagline of UCLA right now is "We the Optimists." And yet we're surrounded in a world where a article with the title, "There's a lot to be optimistic about these days," and then there's the Middle East, seems to be the world in which we live. Actually, FAREED Zakaria, our guest tonight, wrote this article about a week ago, and he started with the following sentence: "There's a lot to be optimistic about today. In almost every part of the world, economies are growing, and war, poverty, and disease are receding. What I would love is just for a moment in our own lives or in the media for us to just stop there, or just continue with the article and tell us really how amazing the world is today." My brother, who never calls me, called me a few years ago, and I knew there was a problem as soon as I saw that it was him. And I picked up the phone, and sure enough, he had bad news, and he told me, I have cancer. I've been diagnosed with cancer. And to me, that's obviously devastating, and for him, devastating. And a few years later, he's completely cancer-free. Something that a decade ago would have killed him now didn't even require chemo. He took a pill twice daily, and I don't know, there's some protein inhibitors or something that knocked the cancer completely out of his body. This is an amazing time to be alive in the world in so many ways. And yet the way that we approach life is exactly the way that this article approached journalism, right? There's all these amazing things. Economies are growing, poverty and disease are receding, but then there's the Middle East. And the rest of the article goes on to talk about the Middle East. And so it seems sometimes like we're in 5% optimism and 95% fear. In welcoming FAREED and the rest of you to UCLA, I want to share with you that UCLA considers itself to be powered by optimism. It's an optimism that we describe as more than a smile or a sunny disposition, right? It's not optimism light. Rather, it's a daring, impactful, resilient, empowering optimism which drives innovation and progress. It's the kind of optimism that unites our multi-faith chaplains here and the University Religious Conference to take a risk, to sell a building that existed for almost 90 years down the street on Hillgard at 900 Hillgard, to establish an endowment and to begin to do real student-based work. And I want to thank the URC and the Council of Chaplains for joining us as being one of the co-sponsors tonight. It's the kind of optimism that 4 years ago, when students were told that if they were going to vote on issues of divestment in the Middle East, that they shouldn't bother to show up at their student government meetings, and in fact, they would be taken before the judicial court here at UCLA. It's the kind of optimism that our students said, well, why don't we take as many students as we possibly can, and why don't we educate people, and why don't we provide them with information and experience so that they can find out for themselves? And now, 4 years later, we've taken on 100 participants to Israel and to Area A of the Palestinian Authority to go and actually see for themselves and to experience it and to find out. And it's an optimism that's characterized in Hatikva of Israel, which sings most prominently, Od lo adva tikvatenu. Still, we the Jews have not lost our hope. Our tikva, our hope, is not lost. We've been singing it for 70 years, but the reality is that we as the Jewish people have been singing it for 3,500 years. So I don't know the content. I haven't seen the content of what's to be presented tonight. But I would encourage both our speaker and all of us to proceed through life reversing the 5% and the 95% rule. Going through life and saying, you know what? Wow, 95%, this is an amazing time to be alive. 95%, I've got kids who are healthy. 95%, I'm here at UCLA on a glorious evening. I'm full, I'm surrounded by friends. 95% that we're gonna live longer than any generation that's ever existed. And 5%, there's serious problems in the world that we really need to go after. If you wanna go 25, 35, I'm not gonna quibble with you about what the percentages are. But nonetheless, I think that life is a gift. I think that living in this time is full of immense responsibility, but also immense power that we can experience through optimism. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. FAREED Zakaria was born in Mumbai, India. He attended college at Yale, received his PhD in government from Harvard. FAREED began his career as the managing editor of Foreign Affairs, the most influential and widely read journal of international politics in the world. In 2000, he left Foreign Affairs to join Newsweek as a regular columnist and editor. In 2008, CNN launched FAREED Zakaria GPS, which continues to air weekly, and in 2012 won a Peabody Award. From 2010 to 2014, he was also editor-at-large of Time Inc. FAREED Zakaria is the author of several best-selling books, including From Wealth to Power, The Future of Freedom, The Post-American World, and most recently, In Defense of a Liberal Education. Among his many honors, he's won the Deadline Club Award for Best Columnist, a National Magazine Award, 2 Overseas Press Club Awards, and the Padma Bhushan Prize. Esquire magazine described him as the most influential foreign policy advisor of his generation. Please join me in welcoming to UCLA, FAREED Zakaria.
Thank you. It's a huge honor to be here, to have a chance to speak at an occasion marked to honor Daniel Pearl. It's a great honor to be at UCLA, and it's a great honor to be introduced by that cavalcade of people before me. I have to confess I've been introduced many times in my life before, never before with a verse from the Bible. So that will stand as a first for me, and I am very grateful to Dr. Pearl, Dr. Professor Rabbi Pearl, for having done that. I think that I am an optimist by nature. Part of it is I grew up in India in the 1960s and 70s, and I came to this country, and life has worked out for me, and life, you know, wherever I've looked, I've seen improvement. I mean, in the India I grew up in had a per capita GDP of about $150. It's more than 20 times higher than that, I suppose, today. If you look at the world at large, I agree with the point that the rabbi was making. It's extraordinary the degree to which we have been able to reduce poverty, eliminate diseases. All these things are really extraordinary. Even if you look at the reality of the decline of violence, we're living in unusually peaceful times. You know, if you look at the charts, I know you hear about a terror attack or a bomb going off, but over the last 40, 50, 60 years, the degree to which organized violence, political violence, wars, civil wars, terrorism has declined is extraordinary. But I think my optimism is not so different from most Americans. You know, Tocqueville once said, when he came to the United States, that Americans were different from Europeans because they actually believed in the perfectibility of man. And they believed that society was in a state of continual improvement, that was sort of what marked them as Americans. So perhaps I'm just describing a very traditional American view. But I think that view and that optimism comes from a belief that human beings, that Americans in particular, will look at the problems in society, will look at the difficulties, will look at the dark side, and view it as a challenge to be overcome, and will then act on it. And that human response to the problem, to the challenge, is crucial. Otherwise, the optimism turns into some kind of complacency that sits in the face of real problems. And so what I want to talk about today is something that is a real problem. We have all this extraordinary good news and these vectors that are moving in the right direction. But we have something that I think we have noticed a bit less than we might have happening in the political realm in the world today. So about 2 years ago, a Stanford scholar, Larry Diamond, wrote an essay in which he pointed out that the world was currently in a democratic recession. That far from being in a world that we sort of had vaguely imagined we were all in after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism and the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which the world was sort of slowly but surely becoming ever more democratic, ever more open, that in fact, since 2006, there had not been a net expansion of democracies in the world, and that there had been 25 significant breakdowns of democracy in the world. Many of these breakdowns were the traditional kind of breakdown of democracy. This is a coup or the collapse of a regime. But others were what I guess one would call the kind of decay of democracy. And this was in some ways the more worrying trend, and it's the one I want to talk about today. I began to notice this a long time ago. In 1996, when we were still in the phase of post-Cold War exuberance, where Eastern Europe had been liberated and was hurtling toward liberal democracy, where countries in Africa that had never held elections, in that decade, I think that they had 50 elections in Africa, where juntas in Latin America were giving way to democratic and elected governments. In that period, I began to notice something that troubled me a lot, which was that you were seeing a lot of elections, but you were seeing what resulted from it as something that didn't look or feel like a real democracy. And I began to realize that the reason was that there was this distinction that one had to make between the democracy part of a liberal democracy and the liberal part of a liberal democracy. What do I mean by this? Well, what you were seeing was a lot of places in the world that were holding elections where people were being democratically elected, but then those governments were systematically abusing their authority, undermining the separation of powers or the checks and balances, discriminating against people, and then using that popular majority that they had to essentially erode this basis of liberal democracy. And I began to realize that really when we think about liberal democracy today, we're really thinking about two distinct traditions, the democratic one and the liberal one. So the democratic one is as old as Herodotus, and it means very simply the rule of the people, the rule of the many. And we know what it means. You hold elections, the people, whoever wins, gets power of government. But there is a much older tradition that is not so much about how you get government, the means of selecting a government, but what constraints and restraints you place on that government. How you limit the powers of government so as to preserve, protect liberty. And that's where the liberal part of the liberal tradition comes from. It doesn't mean liberal in the contemporary American sense. It means it from its Latin root, pertaining to liberty. And that liberal tradition has been an extraordinarily important part of what has characterized and separated Western countries from the rest of the world initially, and now increasingly is something that is viewed universally as important. I mean, it probably starts in its most codified form in 1215 in Runnymede, in a field outside close to Windsor Castle, when a group of barons and earls in England got together and forced King John, who was king at the time, to agree to certain limitations on royal power. This was the first time you had an actual agreement on the limitation of governmental power. And this document, of course, Magna Carta, is seen rightly as the beginning of the protection and preservation of individual rights, individual liberty, and this distinctive form of Western government. And this process of in some way placing some checks and balances on governmental authority extends in an informal way throughout the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, particularly in Britain. It's first codified, actually, in the United States in 1638, in the town of Hartford. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut are written, which is the first actual constitution that sets out the limitations on governmental power. And then, of course, you get in 1789 the American Constitution, and since then, a whole host of others. It is that tradition. Now, in the Western world, these two have been very happily woven together, but we forget that historically and conceptually, they're quite distinct. One is about accumulating power, one is about dividing power. One is about, one has existed in some countries with no democracy. For example, Hong Kong was ruled for many years by the British and had an extraordinarily open, law-based system, and yet had no democracy. It was run by a British Governor-General. And so what has happened now is this happy fusion between liberalism and democracy that we see in the Western world has not quite taken in many other parts of the world. And so what you're beginning to see is what I've described as illiberal democracy. And I began to see it in the 1990s, but at that point I could not have foreseen the extraordinary acceleration of this rise of illiberal democracy. So you look at a country like Russia. It is difficult to remember today that Russia in the 1990s had extraordinary independent political parties, political opposition, an independent press, even the beginnings of an independent judiciary. All of that has been wiped out as the Putin regime has consolidated power and been able to systematically weaken the independent judiciary or destroy it entirely, weaken the free press, destroy it, attack any kind of academic centers of opposition, and indeed take control of the entire economy. These are the crucial institutions that have been attacked in almost all these illiberal democracies. The judiciary, the independent bureaucracies, the free press, and eventually academia, and eventually the economy. And you see this process, and now we think of Russia and we think, well, they had a brief flirtation with democracy. Of course it was going to regress. But what about a place like Turkey? Turkey, the first time I visited, I was stunned and amazed to see a developing country, a Middle Eastern country, a Muslim country that was secular, democratic, law-abiding, had very strong judiciary, had a strong sense of the limitations of governmental power. All that has increasingly disappeared in the last 5 to 7 years in Turkey. Turkey today, a country that is formally a democracy, in which the ruler, the president of Turkey is extremely popular and has won 3 elections. Turkey is today the world's leading jailer of journalists. Think about that. The world's leading jailer of journalists today is a democracy. But now you'll think, well, Turkey, well, that's a, as I say, a non-Western country. It's sad, but it's to be expected. Well, what about countries like Hungary and Poland, where you are beginning to see the same results, sometimes achieved a little bit more in a somewhat more sophisticated manner, sometimes in very similar crude ways. But you have now in Hungary essentially the destruction of the free media. It has been done through a variety of ways. It has been done in some cases by forcing mergers, by withholding government ads. There's a famous example, for example, where one newspaper that had a huge circulation was denied advertising to give to a much smaller newspaper. The same thing happened in Poland, where Adam Michnik's newspaper, Gazeta, I forget exactly how to pronounce the name, but one of the largest anti-communist newspapers in Poland, which had, I think, a circulation of almost 200,000, was deprived of advertising, and that advertising was siphoned to a newspaper that had 10,000 circulation. In some cases, government-friendly oligarchs buy up these newspapers. In some cases, the government launches tax cases against the newspapers. And in almost all cases, by hook or by crook, the television media is intimidated, silenced, coerced, or shut down. Because that is seen, of course, as the most potent and most powerful media. So that process of eliminating these kinds of institutional checks of power is happening in Poland and Hungary just as surely as it is happening in a country like Turkey. It is even beginning to happen in more established democracies, or certainly democracies of longer tenure, like India and Israel, where you are seeing attacks on the free press. The press, in this sense, is a very interesting canary in the coal mine, because there are many things governments can do to intimidate, to coerce, to defund media organizations, which are perfectly legal. You can find some way to attack them on regulatory issues, on tax issues. You can deprive them of government-sponsored advertising in one form or the other. And you can, of course, discredit them by continually attacking them. That has tended not to happen in the past, no longer. And that reality of these extraordinary assaults on these institutions has led to the erosion of the liberal element of a liberal democracy. And think about the range of countries I've talked about. Russia, Turkey, India, Israel, Poland, Hungary. This is happening around the world. The Economist Intelligence Unit has a kind of state of democracy index, and it looks at 60 different indicators. And what it finds is that year after year over the last years, the trend line has been negative, with more and more countries losing core democratic elements in their political systems, core protections of human rights, core limitations of governmental authority. This is the problem we are facing in the world politically today, a significant erosion of liberal democracy, almost everywhere you look. And why it is happening and what to do about it should be the central political question that we grapple with as citizens of the oldest constitutional republic in the world. Now, there's a tendency, I think, in these circumstances to always assume that America will be fine. America is different. America is, as I say, the oldest constitutional republic. And there's good reason for having some sense of a healthy confidence in the American system. The American system is extraordinary, and it's robust. And it's extraordinary because of its design. The American system is designed on the theory that human beings can do bad things. Madison famously writes in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And the American system is premised on that assumption that men are not angels. And it seeks to divide and limit authority in multiple ways at multiple levels. And that is one of the great virtues of the American system. It's very different, by the way, from the French system, for example. The American Revolution believed in that kind of pessimistic view of human nature. The French Revolution believed in a much more optimistic one, which is if the people were sovereign, then why did power need to be limited or checked in any way, right? And that is why the French system has always fused enormous authority in the central government, and in particular in the power, in the person of the head of state, who almost resembles a king. Well, look at the track record, right? Since the French Revolution, France has gone through 2 monarchies, 2 empires, 1 crypto-fascist dictatorship, and 5 republics. And the United States has had a continuous constitutional existence since its founding. So there's reasons for optimism. And that optimism, I think, can be simply put by saying, look, what's going on in Washington is going on, but American institutions are solid. American institutions are very secure. But the problem with that is, what are institutions? You know, institutions sounds like a fancy word, and you think that there's some kind of big, imposing edifice or, a giant obstacle to this erosion that sits there. It's carved into stone and somehow permanent. But the more you examine an institution, you realize that an institution is just a custom. It's a settled practice. It's a way of behaving. I mean, people follow certain practices because they follow certain practices. It's no more than that. It's like table manners or crossing the road at a zebra crossing, which I realize people in UCLA really don't do. But in general, there is people observe these norms, and that becomes an institution. Emerson once said, institutions are lengthened shadows of men. And I think that's essentially right. So look at American institutions. Look at the most important one that has served this path of keeping American politics in some ways grounded and avoiding the kind of radicalism that has resulted in regime collapse in so many countries. It's been political parties. The founders didn't really quite foresee this. They didn't like the idea of political parties. But soon what happened is political parties in America became the place that channeled the fears, the impulses of people, and served as a kind of gatekeeper to in some way bring people together, channel these ideas, work within the mainstream of the system, and recognize and respect the fact that there was an opposing view and an opposing party, and that these were legitimate forms of political contestation and dispute. In a sense, recognizing the legitimacy of the opposition, which is, historically rare. People in the old days used to think that anyone who opposed you who were in power was guilty of treason. Clinton Rossiter, a great social scientist, once said, he had a dictum. He said, no America without democracy, no democracy without politics, and no politics without parties. That was how central people thought parties were to the system. Well, look at what has happened to American parties today, particularly, one has to say, the Republican Party, right? The Republican Party confronted, in the last election cycle, a circumstance where somebody was running for its nomination, who in most senses of the word was not really a Republican. He did not seem to profess the ideas that the Republicans believed in. He professed no particular loyalty to the party. He professed no dedication to working within the system in the way that parties have traditionally done. And instead of in some way fulfilling its role as a gatekeeper, as a channeler, what the party did was collapse, and in a sense allowed for a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, in some ways not particularly hostile. And this one very popular individual, Donald Trump, was able to transform the Republican Party into what has become really an instrument for Donald Trump. If you ask yourself, what are the Republican Party's views on free trade? Well, 2 years ago, you knew what they were. The Republican Party was vociferously in favor of free trade. Well, today, no, because Donald Trump is not. What were the Republican Party's views on immigration? We know what they used to be. We know the party's chief intellectual organ, the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, had once proposed and only once proposed a constitutional amendment. It only proposed one constitutional amendment, and it said that it would be 5 words: there shall be open borders. Yes, the conservative Wall Street Journal editorial page once proposed that there be essentially unlimited open immigration to the United States. Is it conceivable that any conservative intellectual organization would do that today? Right? This is the way in which you've seen this extraordinary reversal, but really collapse of what was meant to be one of the main gatekeepers of American democracy. And then if you look at what has happened in the other institutions that uphold American democracy, well, you look at the judiciary. It is holding up pretty well in the sense that there have been places where the administration has pushed, say, the travel ban, and they've been rebuffed. But remember, while this is happening, of course, the administration is on a ramped-up strategy to stack the courts with as many compliant judges as they can find. And so while what you are seeing right now might be heartening, and it is, just in the sense of the separation of powers, it is not entirely clear that this will persist over a long term. Look at what is happening with the bureaucracies. Well, again, you are seeing the FBI and the intelligence agencies assert their independence, which is important. But over time, the question is, will they be able to? And will other agencies that are not so high profile, that are not in the public eye, will they be able to withstand what is surely going to be an effort to put in place more and more politicized, more and more loyal people at almost every level? You look at what is happening with the free press. It's really an extraordinary circumstance where we have an administration and a president who are almost daily, in some way or the other, denigrating, demeaning the free press, talking about it in ways that delegitimize it, talking about ways in which it should be actually punished, changing libel laws, reining in the press, talking about ways in which there should be laws that punish journalists. And of course, actively talking even about ways to block journalistic platforms. I mean, I work for a company, CNN, where you have the reality that the President of the United States has publicly opined on the fact that a corporate merger should not take place because CNN is a small part of one of the companies involved. While, on the other hand, he has praised another merger, which was the Disney-Fox merger, because he thought that was a wonderful one because Rupert Murdoch supports Donald Trump. These are the kind of things you generally saw in Latin America, not in the United States. But we are living in a media atmosphere that looks like that. And then finally, look at the assault on academia, where in the most recent tax bill, there has been a systematic effort to, in some way or the other, punish universities and single them out among NGOs, by the way, many of whom have not been so punished, because what is clearly seen as a kind of, a war that Donald Trump particularly wants to wage on what he sees as intellectuals and the media and all these kind of fellow traveling members of what he sees as the permanent opposition. This is something he and Steve Bannon have often talked about. The media is the real opposition. Again, this feels to me like the kind of language you would hear out of a Putin, an Erdogan, and in fact it is. So for the last year and a half, you have seen extraordinary reality that authoritarian rulers around the world who have been jailing, punishing, abusing, or in some ways facilitating the killing of journalists have justified what they have said by quoting Donald Trump, by talking about fake news, by talking about the illegitimacy of the media, by talking about the fact that journalists are reprehensible and should be punished. This is a reality. This is something that has happened. I cannot think of a previous moment in history where authoritarian rulers around the world have quoted the President of the United States to support their authoritarian tactics. So when I think about whether the United States could go down this path, of course, fundamentally, I continue to be an optimist. I continue to be an optimist because the American system is extraordinarily well-designed and is extraordinarily vibrant and robust. I continue to be an optimist because I think that at the end of the day, these processes, these challenges produce a counter-reaction. I continue to be an optimist because I think that there are good people in almost all these agencies and the judiciary and places like that, and no matter who appoints them, they will still continue to try their best to serve what they regard as the national interest and act on principle. But that optimism is premised on the idea that there will be a human reaction, that there will be people deciding that it is important to defend liberal democracy, that it is important to counter some of these trends, that it is important to stand up and check the abuse of power. It won't happen if we all sit here and praise the founding fathers and close our eyes and say to ourselves, American democracy will be fine and will survive this. This is not a movie. This is actually happening in our world, in our lives, in our country, in our communities. And by the way, no matter what one thinks of Donald Trump on the policy issues, on which I've said not a word. Conservative, liberal, populist, those are fine. Those are, elections have consequences. People should, people get the policies that the majority votes in. Or in this case, the Electoral College votes in. But that's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the systematic erosion of the norms which make up the institutions, which make up the system that we cherish called American democracy. That's what I worry about. And when you think about what could happen, it's not going to be some cataclysmic coup. Of course not. What is going to happen is the next president will come in, and the next guy running for president, by the way, will say, I know I know there's this institutional understanding, this norm that I'm supposed to release my tax returns, but I've decided not to do it. Donald Trump doesn't do it. Why the hell do I need to do it? And the next time there comes time to pay deference in some way to the other party on some issue, he'll say, well, they didn't do it for the last 5 years, so I don't need to do it. And the next time you have a president who finds a press outlet he doesn't like, he'll feel free to demean it, attack it, find some source of public power that can be used against it. The next time he finds an FBI director he doesn't like, he'll fire him and say, well, look, Trump fired Comey. In other words, each of these institutions can just continue to be steadily undermined while we still live in, the great American democracy. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the senator who was a great public intellectual, once had a wonderful phrase. He called it defining deviancy down. And he talked about the way in which social norms were destroyed not by some cataclysmic blow, but by just slowly defining the standards lower and lower and lower. So we all got to accept a world in which it was a very different standard of behavior expected, and the institutions functioned at a much, much lower level. And that is, in fact, what a lot of these illiberal democracies in the world look like. There is a genuine element of democracy. There are some elements of liberalism, but not a lot. And that mix continues to exist, and human beings adapt. And that's the fear I have. It's not some kind of dramatic end. Probably the best way to describe it would be one of my favorite poems, T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men. Ends with this haunting lines, which I will use and paraphrase. This is how democracy ends. This is how democracy ends. This is how democracy ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
But I thought we could begin with some general foreign policy issues in the world today. Many of us, I'm sure, have been watching the Olympics. The world is focused on Korea, and North Korea continues to be a major issue for the United States and for the international community. Within Washington, many continue to think that there's some way that the nuclear program can be stopped or brought to a halt, at least. And I think many of us view that as perhaps fantastical and believe that the only way is to contain or deter North Korea as we have contained and deterred other nuclear nations. Do you agree with that, and do you think there's something that can be done in the near term, realistically, to bring that program to an end?
I think that it's a very tough question, and there is no there's no magic bullet. But I think the way I would approach this problem is to look at it from the lens of North Korea, which we have tended to view as this completely crazy, maniacal, utterly irrational state ruled by this weirdo with bad hair. And if you just say to yourself, okay, imagine that you're North Korea and your number one goal is to survive. And I don't mean as a country, but as a regime. You're looking at a world in which you're a Soviet satellite state, and the Soviet Union collapses and goes away, and all your support goes away, right? Then China, which was your great other mentor and patron, starts to flirt with the West and increasingly integrates itself into the West and starts withdrawing its support for you. China has voted against North Korea now multiple times, imposing multiple kinds of sanctions on its one treaty ally in the world. By the way, China has one treaty ally in the world, North Korea. If you want to get a sense of the nature of the Chinese relationship, even at a personal level, the president of China, Xi Jinping, has met with the leader of South Korea, the president of South Korea, 10 times. He has met with the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, never. Think about that, right? So you're looking at this world, and then you have the United States, the most powerful country in the history of the world, making absolutely clear it wants to destroy you. And in case it wasn't clear, when the United States was attacked by at 9/11 by 4 Egyptian and 16 Saudi terrorists, guess what it does? It announces the axis of evil in which it links Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as the 3 countries that had to be destroyed, or the regimes that had to be destroyed. So you'd be pretty nervous. You'd be worried about your existence. And so you would buy insurance. And in the world of international affairs, insurance is nuclear weapons. And so that is what North Korea has done. And it has done it pretty cleverly. It has done it fast. It has acquired a robust capacity. And clearly what it seems to me it wants is the ability to say to the United States in particular, and everybody, you can't get rid of us. So that leads me to think this is a pretty rational regime. Even if you look at the way they deal with the Chinese, it's very clever. They know that the Chinese will never pull the rug entirely from under them. So they have done things that have annoyed the hell out of the Chinese, but they know that ultimately the Chinese are scared that if they were to completely cut off the supplies of aid and fuel, essentially food and fuel to North Korea, the regime might collapse, the country might collapse, and then what do you end up with? Millions of refugees pouring into China, and a unified Korea on China's border with 30,000 American troops, a treaty alliance with the United States, and 15 nuclear weapons. Because, of course, the unified Korea would inherit the North's nuclear arsenal. They understand that China doesn't want that. So it strikes me they're playing a very clever game. They are not going to give up their nuclear weapons. The person who's being irrational in this circumstance right now is the United States, the country that's being... We need to recognize that reality, and we need to come to grips with the fact that just as deterrence has worked with Stalin's Russia, just as it worked with Mao's China, just as it worked with the Indians and Pakistanis, deterrence can work with the North Koreans, but we have to get into serious negotiations, get into a process of arms control, get into the kind of confidence-building measures that allow you to have some surety that these things aren't going to happen accidentally or in circumstances that nobody wants. And in order to do that, you have to, in some way, recognize that North Korea had legitimate security concerns for which it has created this deterrent. Look, people who think that they're going to go around, lobbing them all over the world, they know that if they were to do that, North Korea would be destroyed. If you believe anything I've just said, everything they have been doing has been to secure their survival and to secure their existence, and they're done it very rationally and shrewdly and smartly. It seems of all countries, they have shown no desire to use it in a kind of impulsive and an uncalculated way. So I think we have to work on that assumption and move there. And eventually, the more you can get inspections, control, arms control, call it what, and you get them into a system, you could hope for an eventual scenario, like a Ukraine, where perhaps there was a unification on mutually acceptable terms, and the new Korea would recognize that there is no particular value to them having nuclear weapons. But I think that's the long game that we have to be playing for.
Thank you. You mentioned treaty alliances. One of the signature features of U.S. power since 1945 has been our web of alliances. And what's striking about the Trump administration is it has denigrated those alliances in many instances, but it's also, and you've written about this, tried to withdraw, or has withdrawn, and in some cases tried to dismantle certain aspects of the international order as we've known it since 1945. So how dangerous is that, really? And have they been more bark than bite, in your view? In other words, has the talk exceeded the reality? And what are the risks, either way, for us and for the world in general?
Yeah, the talk has certainly exceeded the reality. You know, Trump came in and you had this feeling that he was going to dismantle NATO and dismantle the World Trade Organization and, you know, in some way completely undermine the kind of liberal, open, rule-based system that the United States had created after World War II. Well, you know, as with Trump, as was pretty clear, most of what he says, he doesn't particularly believe in one way or the other. He's saying it because he thinks that that's what an audience wants to hear, and he's right, that there is that sentiment out there in the United States, particularly in his base. But he does believe in some things. Trade is probably one of them. Donald Trump has always been a protectionist. I mean, his first newspaper ad as a real estate developer in the 1980s was an attack on Japan because he thought it was going to take over the world and the United States was going to get screwed. You know, he doesn't seem to have noticed that none of that happened, that in fact all that ended up happening is Japan overpaid for a lot of pricey American real estate like Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center, and the great Japanese menace, you know, went away. Japan has been in almost continuous recession for the last 25 years. But so the new one is, of course, now China and Mexico. That piece of it is, I think, both real and potentially quite damaging because the United States has really led by example. If the United States starts freelancing and engaging in this kind of bilateral deals, well, you know, the Chinese will do the same. The Chinese will be delighted to do that because they have always wanted bilateral deals because their view has always been, if we deal one-on-one with the Philippines, we're going to get a very good deal. But if we have to deal with the World Trade Organization with 150 countries or with the ASEAN, you know, the countries of Southeast Asia, well, then the balance of power is not as tilted in our favor. So the Chinese have always been happy with a mercantilist one-to-one relationship. It is the unique feature of the modern world economy that the most powerful country in it, the United States, chose to adopt a more rules-based system, one in which it, in a sense, diluted this extraordinary power it has, which is why it allowed for the flourishing of others. So that's the part I worry about the most. You know, and my general rule with Trump is I think much of this can be rectified, much of it can be reversed. 2 terms will be hard, because by then the world starts moving on and the Chinese start moving forward. And you're already seeing some of that. You know, the world we're living in is one where the United States is withdrawing from its active leadership role in maintaining this system. The Europeans, which are the other great liberal power that could stabilize the system, are too internally obsessed and consumed by their own problems, and so they are essentially inactive on the world stage. And then you have lots of minor powers, many of which are thoroughly illiberal, you know, like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Russia, that are trying to get more active, and a China that is weighing and watching. Now, that's the world we're in. The longer we wait, the longer we stay out of the game, the more the Chinas, the Russias, the Irans, and the Saudi Arabias will get active, and that activism then becomes the new norm, and that becomes the new system.
Let's continue that on China. So that's the most important bilateral relationship in the world, is the US and China. And many people have noted that Xi Jinping in Davos and elsewhere has given speeches indicating, including at home, his desire and even his acceptance of the idea that China is a global leader today. So as the US is withdrawing in the ways that you've described, do you think that China is assuming that mantle? Has that happened already? Your remarks a moment ago implied that it hasn't happened, but some people believe it does. So where do you sort of place China in that, and what do you see in 10 years?
You know, look, that's obviously the great billion-dollar question in international relations. Will China choose to work within the international order, or will it seek to undermine it and replace it? We don't know yet. I think it is still standing on the sidelines on that question. It clearly wants more influence within that order. There's no question about it. They're actively seeking it. They are the second largest funders of the UN in general, I think, at this point. They are increasingly searching for a greater role in almost every international organization. But beyond that, they are constructing an impressive kind of regional presence, right? So they have this, Belt and Road kind of proposal, which is essentially Chinese aid to build infrastructure in a belt of countries around China that it views as strategically important. In other words, to create economic interdependence that forces countries to be more dependent on China, more dependent on Chinese aid and investment, and it has strategic benefits as well. So you look at, for example, the way they're doing it in the area around India, and it's very clever. They're funding and financing a port in Burma. They're funding and financing a port in Sri Lanka. They're funding and financing a port in Pakistan. So if you think about it, they're essentially encircling India with Chinese-built, Chinese-developed, infrastructure and treaty alliances, or relationships, I shouldn't call them alliances, relationships with all those countries. The problem is, of course, China is not a free trade, open market, liberal power, no matter what Xi Jinping might say at Davos. China remains one of the most mercantilist countries in the world. It's a one-party state. It has a very different conception of global order than the United States or even Britain before it. So what we don't know is what that increased Chinese influence will translate into for a global order. The Chinese really believe more than anything else in China's greatness. The world has gone through a very fascinating 250 years, where for the last 250 years, the leading power in the world has been an Anglo-American liberal power that believed that its goal was to proselytize and to make the whole world more like, England and America. That was the goal of the system was in some way to create, it almost comes out of a high Protestant sense of mission, of proselytizing. China does not have that view. China's view is the goal of China is to make China great. To make China great again, I suppose, if they were to put it on a hat.
They probably have.
Yeah. And they don't think anybody else can be like China. Anybody can be Chinese. They have a very ethno-nationalist sense of it. They're not trying to make people around the world more the Chinese. You can't, because you're not ethnically Han-Chinese. That's not an option for you. Whereas Americans, I think, tend to think that is the goal. And that's a big difference, to have a world where the leading power has an ethno-nationalist conception of its role in the world, as opposed to a universalist conception.
And not to mention thousands of years of believing itself to be the center of that world and wanting to assume that role again. One of the things we know about transitions in power between great powers is often war is part of that transition. So how likely do you think a war between China and the United States is in the next 50 years?
I myself think highly unlikely. The Chinese are very shrewd, they're very strategic. They did a television series called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. I think it was called, maybe just the Rise of the Great Powers. And it was very clear it was a systematic effort to, and this is on Chinese state TV, it ran forever, so hundreds of millions of people watched it. And the message they were sending could be determined by looking at the fact that they started with the Dutch, the French, the Habsburg Empire, but they had only two countries that got 2 episodes, the Soviet Union and the United States. And the message of the Soviet episodes was, the Soviet Union believed you can have lasting international influence by becoming strong militarily, but ignoring your economic foundations of power. And that was a disaster. The U.S. thing was, with the 2 episodes was essentially the opposite. That the U.S. understood that the only way you can have lasting power in the world is by building your economy, by building the basis of your power, and that it was only much later in its development that it acquired the military capacity of a superpower. So I think they get the idea that military force is not the most powerful coin of the realm. Look at their nuclear arsenal today. The Soviet Union and the United States have, 3,000 each. I don't remember the numbers for China, but it's in the hundreds. right? China has maybe 600, 800, something like that. They could easily match Russia's arsenal. They could easily overtake Russia's arsenal. They could even, they could, given their centralized government and the resources they have, they could do something like that. Instead, what they're doing is this Belt and Road Initiative, in which they plan and they announce that they will spend 10 times the dollar equivalent of the Marshall Plan. So that's where their money is going, toward aid, infrastructure, targeted investments to create a web of economic dependency. So the Chinese, in that sense, are playing the long game. I think they recognize that a war would actually be a detriment to China's long-term plan for some kind of dominance. I don't want to make it sound sinister, but they just think, but look, we're the largest country in the world. We're already the second largest economy in the world. We will probably be the largest economy in the world. We have to have influence commensurate with that.
How do you read their efforts in the South China Sea, though? That's an area where they've taken a much more aggressive stance, creating bases, literally building up islands, and in some cases being aggressive with neighbors and even with the US Navy. So do you see that as an effort to create something like what we have understood the Caribbean to be?
Yeah, look, I think we tend to have a slightly short, Americans can never put themselves in other people's shoes. It's very difficult for us. So the United States announced the Monroe Doctrine when the United States wasn't even one of the 10 richest countries in the world, right? And we said the entire Western Hemisphere is ours. And the only reason it worked, by the way, was because we were piggybacking off the British Navy, which was keeping the French out. The Chinese have essentially defined by de facto a kind of Monroe Doctrine in the South China Sea after they're the second richest country in the world, and this is sort of their backyard. Now, I'm not justifying it, and I think that the United States should push back because we believe in freedom of navigation and we believe in open trade routes, and it's important to try to maintain that and to make sure that nothing the Chinese do close that off. But, let's take a breather. This is not like, this is not like the Sudetenland or something like that. This is a very large country that is trying to assert a certain amount of naval dominance. And if you look at China's naval force, it clearly is designed for that kind of regional dominance. Look, the United States has, 11 aircraft carriers? China has 2. One of which is a retrofitted Ukrainian, one which I wouldn't go to war using that one if I were them, and and the other one is sort of in the works. So again, this is a country that is doing fantastically on other dimensions. They're leading the world in high-speed rail. They're leading the world in solar energy. If they wanted to lead the world in aircraft carriers, they would be able to. They are making a conscious decision to emphasize economic power and not military power.
Let me ask a final question before we open it up. We haven't talked about Russia. One of the striking things about Russia, and I'm going to connect this to the cyber conflict question generally, is I think for many years, I remember years ago we had Leon Panetta here, I think for this very lecture, talked about the idea of a cyber Pearl Harbor. People have been afraid about an attack on the power grid, things of that nature. What the last couple of years seem to have shown is that the real risk is disinformation campaigns and the ability to undermine a political process, including our own, and we're unearthing that process right now. So do you see that as a continuing risk for the United States, but also for the sort of things you discussed in your remarks? So the increasing move to authoritarianism around the world, is this adding to that? And again, where do you see that going over the next few years?
There are 2 different elements to the question, I think, one of which is Russia and one of which is cyber, and I think they're both important. The Russian part that is important is the basic problem is Russia has now become a kind of spoiler state. It is probably the only major country in the world right now that really seems intent on eroding, if not destroying, the international system as it exists. And that's partly because Russia is in some ways a dissatisfied power. It feels as though it kind of gave up too much in the surrender at the end of the Cold War. Think about it, Russia gave up not just the Soviet Empire, but large parts of the Russian Empire, including Ukraine, including parts of the old Russian Empire that had been part of it. They've been part of this for 200 years. And so that reality, that sense of loss, is partly what fuels this Russian nationalism that Putin so powerfully embodies. Part of it is that Russia benefits, to put it crudely, Russia benefits from global instability. Russia is an oil-producing country. Right? Russia's entire economy is essentially a natural resources economy, which means in moments of crisis, oil prices go up. Russia does well. So it alone among the major powers in the world does not have an incentive in stability. It actually has an incentive for instability. So that's a very tricky problem that we are going to have to live with for a while. The second is cyber. And on this one, I think it's just, there are some problems that right now don't seem to have very good solutions. Cyber is a very difficult problem to deal with because of it's impossible to detect. The thing about, people sometimes say, well, we had nuclear weapons and then we ended up with arms control and negotiations and things stabilized. Why don't we do that with cyber? Why don't the countries of the world get together? Well, here's the problem. The next cyber attack, you don't know where it's coming from, right? I mean, it certainly doesn't help when the President of the United States says, oh, I don't know if it was Russia, it could have been China, it could have been a 400-pound guy. By the way, why one would think overweight people are good at cyber is something I never quite understood that. But, I mean, all the geeks I've seen tend to be quite thin. But that reality, that it's difficult to identify positively and definitively who it is, means it's very difficult to retaliate. Imagine the President of the United States getting up and saying, we think this was done by X country and therefore we're going to, drop bombs on them? This, by the way, is what the Trump administration has said in its national security statement recently, that cyber attacks will be treated, or we reserve the right to view them as regular attacks and respond. Of course, the irony is that given that there was a real cyber attack that, is pretty close to being definitively proved to have happened and originated from the Kremlin, the administration's response has been total passivity. But it's a very hard one because there isn't an easy way to tell where it came from. There isn't an easy way to deter it. There isn't, an easy way to retaliate other than just to engage in exactly that yourself, which if you're trying to establish international norms and rules is not a great idea. I mean, I understand the temptation people have to say, well, why don't we go and mess with the Russian water supply or something like that? But ask yourself, do you really want to live in a world where countries are doing this to one another? And so I think we have to think about it. At the very least, we need to be having conversations and negotiations at a broader level with, maybe 5, 10, maybe G20 is the right number, the 20 main countries in the world, to try to see if there's some way to create some rules of the road. But the enforcement will be so hard because you know what's going to happen. Anytime something happens, everyone will say, it wasn't me. And that is, of course, what Vladimir Putin says to this day. And so what do you do about that? Cyber is, feels like sometimes above my pay grade.